The cardiac monitor in the private wing of the Harrington estate had been beeping for 6 hours straight, and the sound of it was starting to feel like a countdown. Emmett Harrington, the man who had built a $200 million real estate empire from a single crumbling warehouse in downtown Toronto, was standing outside his daughter's bedroom door with his hands pressed flat against the wood, and he had absolutely no idea what to do next. His daughter, 4-year-old Sophie, hadn't eaten in 4 days. The pediatric specialists he'd flown in from Sick Kids Hospital had tried everything: pureed organic foods, fortified formula through a nasogastric tube that Sophie had screamed and torn out twice, intravenous glucose drips that her tiny, repeatedly punctured veins kept rejecting. She had been through a trauma 2 months ago that no 4-year-old should ever survive. And her body, the doctors said in careful, measured voices while Emmett's jaw tightened to the point of cracking, had simply decided to stop cooperating. Her grief response is manifesting as a somatic shutdown, Mr. Harrington, doctor. Patricia Osei had told him that morning, her voice professionally gentle in a way that made Emmett want to put his fist through the wall. We see it sometimes in young children who have experienced sudden catastrophic loss. Her body is in a kind of protective stasis. She associates eating with her mother, the act of sitting down to a meal, being fed, the smell of food. She's rejecting all of it at a cellular level. We can keep her alive on IV nutrition for another week, perhaps 2, but after that, Emmett had walked out of the room before she could finish the sentence. He owned 4 city blocks in the financial district. He had permits to develop a luxury residential tower in Vancouver that would take up an entire waterfront lot. He had the private cell phone numbers of 2 provincial premiers and a federal cabinet minister. He could not buy his daughter a reason to want to live. Downstairs, in the enormous galley kitchen of the Harrington estate in Rosedale, scrubbing the grout between the marble floor tiles on her hands and knees at 11:30 at night was Joanna Ash. She was 27 years old, and right now she felt about 100. Joanna had been hired 3 weeks ago by the domestic staffing agency that supplied the Harrington household, a discreet, no-background-required service that paid in cash weekly and asked nothing beyond punctuality and silence. She had needed both of those things desperately. The agency hadn't asked why a woman with a nursing degree from Ryerson University was applying to scrub floors. They had simply handed her a uniform and an address in Rosedale and told her to be there by 7 a.m. She hadn't told them about her brother. Callum Ash was 23, and 18 months ago he had made a terrible series of decisions in the company of people who were not the type to forgive them. He owed $46,000 to a man named Stig Brenner, who ran a loan operation out of a dry cleaning business on DuPont Street, and communicated his disappointment through the knees of whoever owed him money. Joanna had already paid $15,000, every dollar she had saved, and it had bought Callum a temporary reprieve and a warning. The remainder was due by the end of the month, or Stig Brenner would stop being patient. She had taken this job because it paid in cash and asked no questions, and because the Harrington estate was the last place anyone from DuPont Street would think to look for her. What she had not anticipated was Sophie. The agency had mentioned in the most oblique possible way that the household included a child going through a difficult period. They had not mentioned that the child had lost her mother in a car accident on the 401 2 months ago. They had not mentioned that the child now lay in a medically appointed room on the 2nd floor, surrounded by expensive equipment and exhausted specialists, and refused to respond to anyone. Joanna had seen Sophie exactly once, a brief glimpse through a half-open door when she was collecting towels from the linen closet at the end of the hall. The little girl had been sitting up in bed, her dark hair loose around her pale face, staring at the wall with eyes that were open, but entirely vacant. One of the nurses had been trying to coax her with a small bowl of applesauce. Sophie had turned her face away without a word. Joanna had stood there for 3 seconds too long, towels pressed against her chest, and then moved on. She was finishing the last section of the kitchen floor when she heard it, faint from somewhere above her. Not the mechanical rhythms of the medical equipment, she had gotten used to those, something else. A child's voice, small and hoarse from disuse. "Mama!" Joanna sat back on her heels. She should not go up there. She was a cleaning woman hired to do floors and surfaces and laundry. The 2nd floor was medical staff territory after 9 p.m. There was a night nurse on duty. A composed woman named Gillian who wore sensible shoes and carried a laminated protocol sheet. But Gillian's station was at the end of the hall, and Sophie's room was at the other end, and the voice had stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by the kind of silence that is somehow worse than crying. Joanna set down her cloth and stood up. The 2nd floor hallway was dim, lit by low sconce lights that someone had turned down for the night. Joanna moved quietly in her rubber-soled shoes, pausing outside Sophie's door. Through the gap at the bottom, she could see the faint blue pulse of monitoring equipment. She pushed the door open. Sophie was not asleep. She was lying on her side in the adjustable hospital bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes fixed on the far wall, where someone had propped a framed photograph. A woman with Sophie's same dark hair and a wide, warm smile, crouching down in what looked like a garden, arms extended toward whoever was holding the camera. Her mother. Sophie's small face was wet. She had been crying without making any sound at all. "Hey," Joanna said softly from the doorway. Just that one word, not a nurse's professional inflection, not an adult's careful management. Just the word, the way you'd say it to someone you knew. Sophie's eyes moved to her, registered Joanna's face, registered the uniform, looked back at the wall. "I know," Joanna said. She stayed in the doorway. She did not come closer, did not reach for the call button, did not reach for the bowl of untouched applesauce on the side table. "I know exactly what that feels like. Missing someone so much your body doesn't know what to do with itself anymore." Sophie's eyes came back to her again, slowly. "My mum died when I was 8, Joanna said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do, without preamble, without strategy. And for about 2 weeks after, I couldn't eat either. Couldn't swallow. Everything tasted like nothing. It scared my dad half to death." A long silence. The monitor beeped its slow, steady rhythm. "What made you eat?" Sophie asked. Her voice was graveled from days of near silence, but it was a real question, a genuine one. Joanna leaned her shoulder against the doorframe. "My dad's neighbor, Mrs. Kowalczyk." She was this ancient Polish woman from 2 doors down. She barely spoke English. She showed up at our house with a pot of something that smelled like everything good and warm and safe at the same time. She just put it on the stove and left. She didn't make me eat it. She didn't sit there and watch me. Joanna paused. "I ate 3 bowls. I don't know why. I think it was because nobody was waiting for me to." Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't like the food they bring. What do you like?" Another silence. Longer, Joanna waited. "Mummy used to make scrambled eggs," Sophie said, "with the butter and the little green things." "Chives?" "The little green things. She cut them with scissors." "I could make that," Joanna said. Sophie looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You're the floor lady. I am absolutely the floor lady," Joanna agreed. "I'm also a reasonably good scrambled egg maker, but only if you want. I'm not going to sit here and watch you eat it. I'll just leave it." The silence stretched out. Joanna was prepared for a no. She was prepared for Sophie to turn her face back to the wall. "Okay," Sophie said very quietly. Joanna made the eggs in the kitchen. Real butter, low heat, chives she found in a small pot on the windowsill of the garden room. She loaded them onto a small white plate and carried them upstairs and set them on Sophie's side table without fanfare, adjusted the lamp to a softer angle, and left. She was back on the second stair from the bottom when she heard the faint, tentative sound of a fork scraping ceramic. She sat down on the step and pressed her hand over her mouth. She did not cry. She had not let herself cry in a very long time. But she sat there on the stairs in the dark and breathed, and listened to the sound of a little girl eating for the first time in 4 days. She almost didn't hear the footsteps behind her. "What did you give her?" The voice was quiet, not gentle. Quiet the way a very controlled person is quiet when they are not feeling controlled at all. Joanna turned around. Emmett Harrington was standing at the bottom of the stairs in dark trousers and a dress shirt with the collar open. He was 38 or so. She hadn't paid much attention when the agency briefed her, and right now he looked like a man who had not slept properly in 2 months. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with lighting. His jaw was tightly set. He was also staring at her like she had done something that required immediate explanation. "Scrambled eggs," Joanna said, "with chives." She asked for them. Emmett Harrington's expression didn't change. He looked from Joanna to the ceiling, toward where Sophie's room was, and back. "She spoke to you?" "Yes, Doctor. Osi hasn't been able to get a full sentence out of her in 3 days. "I'm not Dr. Osi," Joanna said. She wasn't being difficult. It was simply a fact. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were dark and sharp and currently doing something that felt uncomfortably like cataloging. "What's your name?" "Joanna Ash. I've been on the cleaning staff for 3 weeks. He nodded once, the nod of a man filing information file. Then he turned and went down the hallway toward his study without another word. By the morning, Joanna's duties had been quietly, unilaterally reorganized. She wasn't told directly. The head housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Fowler, called her into the kitchen and explained in the tone of someone conveying information rather than requesting agreement that Mr. Harrington had decided Joanna would be reassigned from cleaning to companion duties for Sophie, effective immediately, at a significantly increased weekly rate. Her access to the second floor was unrestricted. She was to eat her meals with Sophie. She was to follow Sophie's lead on everything and not impose structure unless Sophie requested it. "And what exactly is my job title?" Joanna asked. Mrs. Fowler looked at her over her reading glasses. Mr. Harrington didn't specify. Joanna had a nursing background. She knew grief. She knew children. None of this made her feel remotely prepared for the small, serious person who regarded her from the hospital bed on that first official morning with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had recently learned that adults were not always reliable. "You came back," Sophie said. "I did. Why?" Joanna considered the question seriously, which Sophie seemed to appreciate. "Because you're interesting, and because I think you're much braver than anyone around here is giving you credit for." Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then, "What's your name?" "Joanna." "Joanna." Sophie tried it out in two distinct syllables like she was tasting it. "Can I call you Joe?" "Sure. Okay, Joe." Sophie reached over and picked up the small stuffed rabbit that had been sitting ignored at the edge of her bed. She set it in her lap. "This is Clementine." Over the following 2 weeks, Sophie began to eat. Not abundantly, not without coaxing, but steadily. Small meals, real food, things she and Joanna discussed and chose together as though it were a negotiation between equals. Joanna read to her in the afternoons. She told her stories about growing up in Hamilton, about her brother Callum's catastrophic attempts at baking, about the old dog they'd had who was afraid of butterflies. She did not force Sophie to talk about her mother. She did not redirect her when Sophie did want to talk about her mother, which turned out to be often and in remarkable detail. The garden, the laugh, the way she'd always let Sophie stay up too late on Friday nights watching movies. Emmett Harrington visited the nursery every evening. He was careful about it. Quiet knock, brief visit, sat in the chair near the window while Sophie talked or while Joanna read aloud, and he listened. He rarely spoke during these visits. He watched his daughter with an expression of such concentrated relief that Joanna made a point of not looking at him directly, because it felt like something private. But she noticed things. She noticed that he always paused in the doorway for a second before entering, the way a person does when they've been dreading a room and then find it better than they've feared. She noticed the way his shoulders dropped fractionally when Sophie laughed. A real laugh, increasingly frequent now, nothing like the hollow silence of the first days. She noticed that he sometimes looked at Joanna with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated, something she didn't let herself examine too closely. She also noticed the man in the grey Mercedes that had been parked outside the service entrance for 3 days running. Joanna had learned to notice things like that. It was a skill acquired over 18 months of being afraid, of watching exits and unfamiliar faces and cars that appeared in multiple locations. Callum's debt to Stig Brenner had not gone away because Joanna had taken a job in Rosedale. It had simply paused. The envelope appeared on a Thursday. She found it tucked under the wiper of her bicycle when she went out to the courtyard on her afternoon break. Plain white. Her full name, Joanna Marie Ashe, written on the front in block print. Inside, a photograph, her brother Callum, standing outside a Tim Hortons on Bloor Street, looking over his shoulder. Taken recently, she could tell by the jacket he was wearing, one he'd bought last month. Below the photograph, one line of text, "Time's up. Tell your boss hello." Joanna stood in the courtyard with the envelope in her hands and felt the specific nauseating drop of someone watching a ceiling they've been holding up finally come down. She put the envelope in her jacket pocket. She went back inside. She finished reading to Sophie. She tucked Clementine in beside Sophie at 8 o'clock and told her she'd see her in the morning. She was in the kitchen making tea when Emmett Harrington found her. He came in without turning on the main lights, the way he often did at night. The under-cabinet lighting was enough, and he seemed to prefer the house quiet. He stopped when he saw her at the counter. "You're still here." "Couldn't sleep," Joanna said, which was true. He went to the other side of the island and poured himself a glass of water. She could feel him looking at her, and she didn't look back, and that was probably why he noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Joanna." It was the first time he'd said her name without a surname attached. She was not going to think about that right now. "It's not a work matter, Mr. Harrington. I'm sorry, I'll take it off the premises. Show me." She looked at him then. His expression was entirely level, not demanding, not pitying, just waiting. The expression of a man who has learned to assess a situation quickly and is currently doing so. She put the envelope on the counter. He read it without touching the photograph. Then he looked up at her. She explained. All of it. Callum, the debt, Stig Brenner, and the dry cleaning front on DuPont, the grey Mercedes outside the service entrance. She explained that she had taken this job to hide, and that her brother was not safe, and that she had been trying to manage it without letting it intersect with the household. She explained it in the flat, factual voice she used when she was very afraid and needed to not show it. When she finished, Emmett Harrington was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. 31,000. That's the full amount your brother owes. With Brenner's interest, yes. He nodded. He picked up his phone from the counter and typed a brief message. Set it back down. Consider it handled, he said. Joanna stared at him. Mr. Harrington, Brenner operates out of a dry cleaning business on DuPont Street. His voice was measured, factual. I've been trying to buy that block for 2 years. His landlord and I have a pre-existing relationship that Brenner is unaware of. I will make a call in the morning. By noon, the debt is cleared, and the lease on Brenner's business premises is being reviewed for some significant zoning complications. He met her eyes. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm solving a problem that is inside my house. My brother's problem is not inside your house. You are inside my house, Emmett Harrington said. Your brother's problem came to my gate. That makes it inside my house. Joanna did not know what to say to this. She looked at the envelope on the counter. The man in the grey Mercedes, she said. My head of security is already aware of him. She looked up sharply. How long have you known? Since Tuesday. Something shifted in his expression, not quite apology, not quite the controlled professionalism of 2 minutes ago. I was waiting to see if you'd tell me. Joanna breathed out through her nose. That's a little invasive. Yes, he agreed without apology. I have a 4-year-old daughter I almost lost. I tend toward invasive when it comes to the safety of people in this house. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the garden was dark, the string lights Miss Innes had put up for spring not yet turned on. She's doing so much better, Joanna said. It came out softer than she intended. I know. He was still watching her. She asked me tonight if you could stay. Stay? Permanently. She asked if Joe was going to live here now. He paused. She said she was worried you might leave. Joanna felt something shift in her chest. That particular pressure that lives just below the sternum and generally means something you've been holding very carefully is starting to move. She doesn't need to worry about that, Joanna said. I told her that. A pause. I wanted to tell her the same thing for my own reasons. I wasn't sure I had the right. Joanna looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. She probably should not be having this conversation at 11:45 at night in her employer's kitchen. And she was fairly certain Emmett Harrington knew that too, and neither of them moved. What she said was, you have 4-year-old daughter who needs stable and predictable adults in her life. That's the only reason that matters right now, agreed, he said. A beat, and in a year, when she's stable and predictable is established. Joanna picked up her mug. Ask me in a year, Mr. Harrington. The faintest thing crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile had recently been. Emmett, he said. My name is Emmett. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a while. The problem was that Joanna was observant. It was both her greatest professional asset and, at moments like this, a considerable inconvenience. She noticed things. She catalogued them without meaning to. The way some people do when they have spent a long time in situations where noticing things was the difference between managing and not managing. And over the 3 weeks that followed, 3 weeks during which Callum called her twice to say, shaken and bewildered, that Brenner had dropped his debt entirely, and then vacated his premises with extraordinary speed. 3 weeks during which Sophie graduated from the hospital bed to her actual bedroom and began sleeping through the night and asking if she could plant tomatoes in the garden. Joanna noticed that something was wrong in the Harrington house. It started with Emmett's brother. Garrett Harrington was 34, polished in the particular way of someone who had spent his whole life being compared to an older sibling and had developed a compensating shine. He visited the estate on a Tuesday, ostensibly to discuss a family trust matter with Emmett. He brought flowers for Sophie, an oddly formal gesture for an uncle visiting a 4-year-old, and he smiled at Joanna with the specific warmth of a person taking careful note of her presence. So you're the miracle worker, he said. I'm the companion, Joanna said. She's too modest, Garrett told Emmett, with a hand on Emmett's shoulder that stayed a half-second too long. She clearly means a great deal to Sophie. To the household. The glance he slid toward Joanna was brief and precise. It must be a comfort to have someone you trust that completely. Joanna kept her face pleasant and empty and thought, I don't like you. She filed it away. The second thing she noticed was the medication. Sophie took 2 prescription supplements daily, both unremarkable, both verified by Dr. Osei. One for iron and one a children's probiotic to help re-establish her gut after the weeks of IV nutrition. They were kept in a child-proof cabinet in the kitchen, clearly labeled, administered by Joanna every morning with breakfast. On a Wednesday morning, Joanna noticed that the probiotic bottle had been moved. Not by much, a few centimeters rotated slightly on the shelf. The tamper-evident seal around the cap was intact. But Joanna had been a nursing student before she'd been a floor scrubber, and she had a deeply ingrained habit of setting things back in exactly the same position, and that bottle had been moved by someone who was not her. She did not say anything. She put the bottle in her jacket pocket and gave Sophie the iron supplement alone, telling Sophie the probiotic was on back order, and she'd have it tomorrow. Then she walked to a pharmacy on Yonge Street on her lunch break and asked the pharmacist to analyze the contents. She came back with a text from the pharmacist 2 hours later. The text said, "Not a standard probiotic. This contains loperamide and a synthetic compound I don't recognize. Not OTC, possibly compounded. At the dosage in this bottle, in a child under 5, it would cause progressive GI disruption over 2 to 3 weeks. Call poison control." Joanna sat on a bench on the sidewalk for a full minute and stared at her phone. Sophie had been sick, she was getting better, and someone had replaced her medication with something designed to make her sick again. She thought of Garrett Harrington's hand on his brother's shoulder, the particular precision of his eyes when he said, "It must be a comfort to have someone you trust that completely." She thought about what Sophie represented, not just to Emmett, but on paper. She thought about what she knew about family trusts and succession and the kind of men who brought flowers to 4-year-olds for reasons that had nothing to do with the 4-year-old. She texted Emmett, "Need to speak with you tonight. Alone. Urgent." He replied in under a minute. 8 o'clock. What happened in that study at 8 o'clock? Emmett sitting forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and his face doing something very still and very dangerous, while Joanna laid out the pharmacist's text and the replaced bottle and the Tuesday visit, and every micro-observation she'd catalogued over weeks was one of the quieter conversations Joanna had ever been part of, and also one of the most frightening, because the quieter Emmett Harrington became, the more clearly the room understood that he was not calm. He was the specific stillness of someone who has taken a great deal of violent feeling and put it somewhere it won't destroy the furniture. "You're sure," he said. "The pharmacist's text is there." Joanna gestured to his phone, where she'd forwarded it. "I'd recommend having the compound independently verified, but yes. I'm sure. My daughter has been taking this for 6 days. The dosage appears to be calibrated for a slow effect. She wouldn't be showing symptoms yet." Joanna kept her voice level. "I caught it early." Emmett stood up from the chair. He walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark garden where Sophie's new tomato seedlings were lined up in small pots on the sill. "My brother," he said. "It wasn't a question. I can't prove it, but the timing of the visit, I know." He turned back to face her. His expression had resolved into something clear and very cold. "Sophie's trust holds 40% of the voting shares in Harrington Capital. If Sophie is incapacitated, if her health is deemed unstable, control reverts to the board pending a guardianship review. Garrett is on the board. He has been trying to force a restructuring for 8 months. He looked at Joanna steadily. "I knew he was ambitious. I did not know he was this." Joanna said nothing. "Sometimes the best thing you can offer is silence. I need you to keep this between us," Emmett said. "For now, Garrett believes he's being subtle. That's an advantage I won't surrender by confronting him directly before I have what I need. What do you need?" "Evidence that holds in front of the board. Not just a pharmacist's text. A chain of custody." He met her eyes. "I need 3 more days. Can you keep Sophie safe for 3 days without Garrett knowing we're aware?" Joanna thought of Sophie and her tomato seedlings and Clementine the rabbit. "Yes," she said. Those 3 days were the longest of Joanna's life. She was meticulous. She checked everything that entered Sophie's room. She varied their routine enough to avoid predictability without frightening Sophie. She slept poorly and was extremely pleasant at breakfast. Garrett visited once more, dropped by unannounced on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to leave some documents for Emmett, and spent 12 minutes in the kitchen with Joanna while Sophie napped, asking careful questions in a warm, interested tone that Joanna answered with warm, interested deflection. She watched him. He was very good. He was also, she had come to understand, the kind of person who assumed that people in service roles did not have the capacity to outthink him. It was a significant blind spot. What she did not expect was Saturday night. Sophie had been settled in bed. Emmett had texted to say the evidence chain was complete. The compound had been traced to a private pharmacy in Oakville, with a verified paper trail connected to a shell account Garrett had used twice before. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Garrett did not yet know any of this. Joanna was in the sitting room off the hallway when all the lights went out. Not a blown fuse. The main panel was in the basement and was on a separate circuit from the backup system. For every light in the house to go out simultaneously meant the main had been cut deliberately. Joanna was on her feet before the darkness had fully registered. She moved fast and quiet down the hall towards Sophie's room, one hand trailing the wall. Behind her, she heard a door open. The back door, the one to the garden, that was supposed to be secured by a keypad system. Sophie was awake when Joanna slipped into the room, sitting up in the dark, holding Clementine, eyes wide and frightened. "Jo, I'm here." Joanna crossed the room, crouching in front of her. "I need you to do something very important for me, okay? I need you to come with me right now and be very quiet. Like a game. I'm scared, I know. Hold on to my hand. Hold Clementine tight." She lifted Sophie onto her hip and moved toward the door. The hallway was not empty. A man she didn't recognize was at the far end, moving toward them. He was large and methodical, and had the unhurried pace of someone who believes they have the advantage. And in the blue-gray emergency light from the stairwell exit sign, she could see he was not a member of the household staff. Joanna pulled Sophie back into the room and locked the door with her shoulder against the frame, scanning the space. The medical bassisnet from Sophie's early days was gone, but the room was Sophie's actual bedroom now. There was a dresser, a bookshelf, a child's desk with solid wood legs. She handed Sophie to the far corner with a whisper to stay small and stay quiet, and then she picked up the desk lamp, heavy, ceramic base, the kind that doesn't move when you lean on it to read, and she stood behind the door. The handle turned. The lock held for approximately 4 seconds before the frame splintered. Joanna swung the lamp base with everything she had. The ceramic connected with the man's forearm with a sound that was not pleasant, and he went sideways into the doorframe, dropping whatever he'd been holding. A zip tie, she saw, which sent a cold, clear rage through her that was entirely clarifying. She hit him again, in the shoulder, and he went down to one knee. Then the hallway exploded into light, not the household lights, torchlight, 3 beams, and behind them the sound of running feet on the service stairs. Emmett's head of security, Marcus Webb, came through the door at the end of the hall like something had been launched, followed by 2 of his team, and then Emmett himself, in a dark jacket with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face when his torch beam found the man on the floor of Sophie's doorway, and then found Joanna standing over him with a broken lamp in her hands, was something Joanna did not have immediate language for. Marcus Webb had the man secured in approximately 45 seconds. Garrett Harrington was apprehended at the service exit by the second team, attempting to leave in the direction of the back lane. He was, according to Marcus Webb's subsequent report to Emmett, extremely surprised. Emmett sent Sophie via his housekeeper in a car with 2 security personnel to spend the night at this home of Sophie's favorite school friend without any ceremony or explanation beyond an adventure sleepover. Sophie, who trusted Joanna completely by this point, went after extracting a promise that Clementine would be returned to her by morning. Then Emmett came back to the hallway. The security team had cleared out. Mrs. Fowler had put on tea without being asked. The house was quiet in the specific way of a crisis that has passed. Emmett stood in the doorway of Sophie's room looking at the broken lamp on the floor and the splintered doorframe and at Joanna, who was sitting on the edge of Sophie's bed with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't remember being handed. "You fought him," Emmett said. "He had zip ties," Joanna said. "I wasn't going to wait for the security team." He crossed the room and sat down beside her on the edge of the bed. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which her body, she noted distantly, seemed to have developed a strong opinion about. "She was in the corner," Joanna said. "She was holding Clementine. She didn't make a sound. She's braver than anyone knows. She's 4. She shouldn't have to be brave." "No," Emmett said. "She shouldn't." They sat like that for a moment. The house settled around them. "He was going to take her," Joanna said. It wasn't a question. She'd worked it out in the clarity of the last hour. Leverage. For the board vote on Monday, if he had Sophie, he could have delayed the vote indefinitely. Possibly forced a settlement. Emmett's voice was completely even, which she had come to understand meant the opposite of calm. "He had the compound in her medication. He had someone on the inside of my security rotation. He had planned this for weeks. He underestimated the floor lady," Joanna said. She hadn't meant it to land that way. But Emmett turned to look at her, and what was on his face was not the contained relief she had catalogued from the doorway of Sophie's room for weeks. It was something much less managed than that, something that had clearly been there for a while, working its way to the surface despite a person's best efforts at professionalism. "You found the medication," he said. "You brought me the evidence. You kept my daughter safe for 3 days without showing your hand, and tonight I hit someone with a lamp," Joanna said. "Yes, the faintest thing in the corner of his mouth. That too, Mr. Harrington." "Emmett." She looked at him. He looked at her. The mug was warm in her hands. "Emmett," she said. "I had a question I was going to ask you in a year," he said. "I'm aware that it's been 3 weeks and not a year, and that this is highly unreasonable timing given the context. But I find that recent events have adjusted my sense of when to say the things I mean to say." Joanna waited. "Stay," he said. Not as Sophie's companion, not as an employee. Stay because this house is better than it's been since before. Stay because my daughter loves you and I, he paused. Because I would very much like the chance to know you properly, in circumstances that do not involve pharmaceutical tampering or ceramic weaponry. Joanna looked at the broken lamp on the floor. She looked at the small indent in the corner where Sophie had pressed herself against the wall and held on to Clementine and trusted her, completely in the dark. She thought of her own mother, of Mrs. Kowalczyk's pot on the stove, and how some things find the places they're supposed to go through entirely unexpected doors. "I'm going to need a better lamp," she said. His laugh, when it came, was quiet and genuine and startled, as if it surprised him, and Joanna thought, "That's the one. That's the real one." It looked exactly like Sophie's. He reached over and took the mug out of her hands and set it on the nightstand, and then he took her hand in both of his, careful, unhurried, the way he did most things she had come to understand were important to him, and he held it. They sat in Sophie's room while the house settled around them, and through the window the garden was dark, and the tomato seedlings in their little pots were lined up on the sill, and somewhere across the city a 4-year-old girl was sleeping safely, with a stuffed rabbit named Clementine tucked under her chin, dreaming, for the first time in a long time, without nightmares. Outside, the first pale edges of a Toronto morning were beginning to come up over the rooftops. It looked, Joanna thought, exactly like something starting.